The distant howl of a lone wolf carried across the Dakota plains as Thomas Tucker stood frozen in his cabin doorway, his heart breaking at the sight before him. His 5-year-old daughter sat cross-legged on the rough wooden floor, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged face as she cradled the broken remains of her beloved porcelain doll, the last gift from her mother before consumption had claimed her life nearly a year ago. "She's broken, Papa," little Sarah whispered, her tiny fingers trembling as she tried to fit the doll's detached arm back into place. "Mama's doll is broken and I can't fix her." Dakota Territory, 1876. The unforgiving land had taken nearly everything from Thomas, his wife, his dreams of prosperity, and now, it seemed, even his daughter's precious memento. At 32, the former Union cavalry officer had retreated west after the war, hoping to build a life far from the bloodshed and loss that had haunted him across battlefields from Antietam to Appomattox. But peace had proven elusive, and raising a child alone on the frontier tested him daily in ways rifle fire never had. "Let me see her, sweetheart," Thomas said softly, kneeling beside his daughter. His calloused hands, more accustomed to axe handles and rifle stocks than delicate porcelain, examined the damage. The doll's arm had completely separated at the shoulder, and a crack ran from her neck down across her painted bodice. Sarah looked up, her eyes so much like her mother's swimming with fresh tears. "Can you fix her, Papa, please?" Thomas swallowed hard. He could break a wild horse, build a cabin with his bare hands, and hit a target at 300 yards, but this delicate task was beyond his abilities. The doll's pale face stared up at him accusingly, its painted features a cruel echo of his late wife's gentle countenance. "I'll try, darlin'," he promised, though he knew his rough attempts would likely make things worse. "But first, let's get you something to eat." Later that evening, after tucking an exhausted Sarah into bed, Thomas sat at his crude table, the broken doll before him, illuminated by lantern light. He tried everything: carpenter's glue, thin strips of leather, even whittling a small wooden peg to reconnect the arm. Nothing worked properly, and his frustration mounted with each failed attempt. Tomorrow was market day. He'd have to make the half-day ride into Willow Creek anyway for supplies. Perhaps someone there could help, though he doubted it. The frontier settlement barely had a proper doctor, let alone someone who could mend a delicate porcelain doll. Dawn broke cool and clear across the prairie. Thomas prepared a simple breakfast, roused Sarah, and helped her dress. She asked immediately about her doll. "She's resting," Thomas said, unable to admit his failure. "We're heading to town today. Maybe we'll find something there to help her feel better." Sarah nodded solemnly, accepting his explanation with a child's faith that her father could solve any problem. The ride to Willow Creek was quiet, Sarah sitting before him on the saddle of his sturdy bay gelding. The settlement had grown substantially in the 3 years since they'd arrived in the territory. What had been little more than a trading post and saloon now boasted a proper general store, a small church, even a schoolhouse. The railroad survey teams had come through last spring, promising the Iron Horse would follow within 2 years. Progress marched westward, whether the land and its people were ready or not. Thomas tethered his horse outside Gunderson's general store and lifted Sarah down. "Stay close now," he cautioned, though the warning was unnecessary. Since her mother's passing, Sarah rarely strayed from his side. The bell above the door announced their entry. Thomas nodded to Mrs. Gunderson, a heavy-set woman with perpetually rosy cheeks who managed the store while her husband handled the freight contracts. "Mr. Tucker, Miss Sarah," the woman greeted them warmly. "What can I help you with today?" Thomas ran through his list of necessities: flour, coffee, ammunition, a new pair of work gloves, while Sarah stood silently beside him, her small hand gripping his pant leg. As Mrs. Gunderson gathered their items, the bell chimed again. Thomas turned to see a woman he'd never encountered before. She stood just inside the doorway, removing a modest bonnet to reveal hair the color of autumn wheat, gathered neatly at her nape. She wore a simple blue calico dress, practical yet becoming, and carried a market basket over one arm. "Good morning," she offered with a slight smile, her voice carrying a trace of an Eastern accent. Mrs. Gunderson beamed. "Miss Tate, come in, come in. I was hoping you'd stop by today. The shipment of threads you ordered arrived yesterday." Thomas nodded politely and turned his attention back to his supplies, though he found himself inexplicably aware of the woman's movements as she browsed the store's modest selection of dry goods. It was only when Sarah tugged at his sleeve that he realized his daughter had been studying the newcomer intently. "Papa," she whispered, though her whisper carried in the quiet store, "that lady has the same color hair as my doll." Thomas felt heat rise to his face as the woman Miss Tate glanced their way with a gentle smile. "Sarah," he admonished quietly, "it's not polite to your doll." The woman approached, her expression kind as she addressed Sarah directly. "Do you have a favorite doll, sweetheart?" Sarah nodded solemnly. "She's broken. Papa tried to fix her, but she's still hurt." Thomas cleared his throat. "It's a porcelain doll. The arms come off and there's a crack across the chest. I'm afraid it's beyond my abilities to repair." The woman's eyes a clear hazel that reminded Thomas of shallow creek water over smooth stones lit with interest. "I might be able to help. I've some experience with such things." "You fix dolls?" Sarah asked, hope blossoming in her voice. Miss Tate knelt to Sarah's level, her movement graceful despite the constraints of her modest dress. "I've mended a few in my time. I'm Tabitha Daniels. I arrived in Willow Creek just last month to assist Reverend Wilson's wife with the new school." "The school teacher?" Thomas asked. She rose, smoothing her skirts. "Assistant teacher for now. The children call me Miss Tate." A smile touched her lips. "Adults may call me Tabitha if they wish." Thomas suddenly realized he was staring. He extended his hand. "Thomas Tucker, this is my daughter, Sarah. We have a homestead about 10 miles east of here." Her hand was slender but firm in his calloused grip. "A pleasure, Mr. Tucker. Would you really look at Sarah's doll? It was her mother's." He trailed off, not wanting to burden a stranger with their grief. Understanding crossed Tabitha's features. "Of course. If you'd like to bring it by the schoolhouse this afternoon, I'd be happy to examine it. I lodge in the small room at the back." Relief and something else, something he couldn't quite name, washed through Thomas. "That's mighty kind." "We don't want to impose, it's no imposition," Tabitha assured him. "Children's treasures are important matters." As they completed their transactions and prepared to leave, Thomas found himself strangely reluctant to depart. It had been a long time since he'd exchanged more than passing pleasantries with anyone, let alone someone like Tabitha Daniels, whose refined manner suggested an education and background far removed from frontier life. "The schoolhouse, then," he confirmed. "We'll stop by before heading home." Sarah practically bounced with excitement as they left the store, peppering Thomas with questions about the nice lady who might be able to fix her doll. He answered distractedly, his thoughts lingering on the unexpected encounter. They spent the morning conducting their business in town, delivering a half-dozen deerskins to the tanner, arranging for a wagon load of lumber to be delivered the following week for repairs to the barn roof, stopping by the post office on the slim chance there might be a letter from Thomas's brother back in Pennsylvania. There never was. By early afternoon, they'd completed their errands and collected the broken doll from their saddlebags. The schoolhouse sat on the eastern edge of town, a simple one-room structure with a small bell tower. A modest addition had been built onto the back, presumably the lodging Tabitha had mentioned. Thomas hesitated at the door, suddenly aware of his rough appearance, 3-day stubble, dust-covered clothes, and the lingering scent of horse and leather that no amount of scrubbing ever fully removed. Sarah, however, had no such reservations and knocked boldly. Moments later, Tabitha appeared, her smile widening at the sight of them. She'd exchanged her bonnet for a simple ribbon that held back tendrils of golden hair from her face. "Mr. Tucker, Miss Sarah, please come in." The schoolroom was neat and orderly, with rows of simple desks facing a larger teacher's desk at the front. A blackboard dominated the wall behind it, and educational charts hung alongside biblical quotations. A door at the rear presumably led to Tabitha's quarters. "The children have gone for the day," she explained, gesturing toward a work table set against one wall. "Let's have a look at your patient, shall we?" Sarah carefully unwrapped the doll from the cloth Thomas had used to protect it during their journey. The porcelain face, with its delicately painted features and rosebud mouth, stared up from the table. The separated arm lay beside it, and the crack across the torso seemed even more pronounced in the clear afternoon light. Tabitha made a sympathetic sound. "She's lovely. German-made, I'd venture." "What's her name?" "Lily," Sarah answered promptly. "Mama named her Lily because of the flowers on her dress." Thomas watched as Tabitha gently examined the doll, her fingers moving with careful precision over the damaged porcelain. He was struck by the tenderness in her expression, the way she spoke directly to Sarah as if the child's concerns were of utmost importance. "I believe I can help Lily feel better," Tabitha finally announced. "The arm can be reattached with special glue I have, and while I can't remove the crack, I can stabilize it so it won't worsen. Then I'll need to replace her dress, see how the fabric has rotted at the seams. I have some lovely material that would suit her well." Sarah's eyes widened. "You can make her a new dress, if that's all right with you." Tabitha looked from Sarah to Thomas. "I'd need to keep her for a few days to do the work properly." Thomas saw the momentary panic in his daughter's eyes at the thought of being separated from her treasure. "Perhaps you could show Sarah how you'd fix her," he suggested. "We could stay a while if you're not too busy." The smile that bloomed on Tabitha's face made something tighten in Thomas's chest. "I'd like that very much." What followed was a remarkable transformation not just of the doll, but of Sarah. As Tabitha worked, explaining each step and allowing Sarah to help where possible, his usually solemn daughter laughed and chattered in a way he hadn't seen since before his wife's illness. They watched as Tabitha mixed a special adhesive from substances in small glass bottles, carefully reattaching the arm and reinforcing the crack with thin strips of cloth soaked in the mixture. "The dress will take longer," Tabitha explained as the glue dried. "But look what I have." She disappeared into her quarters, returning with a small wooden box. Inside, neatly organized, were scraps of fabric in various colors and patterns. "Would you like to choose what Lily should wear?" Sarah's delight was palpable as she sorted through the offerings, finally selecting a pattern of tiny blue flowers on cream-colored cotton. "Like the prairie in spring," she declared. Thomas found himself captivated, not by the doll's repair, but by the easy way Tabitha engaged with his daughter, drawing her out with questions and genuine interest. The afternoon light slanted through the schoolhouse windows, casting a golden glow over the scene, and Thomas realized with a start that hours had passed. "We're keeping you from your evening," he said reluctantly. "We should head back before dark." Disappointment flashed across Tabitha's features, quickly masked. "Of course, the roads aren't safe after sunset." "When can we come back for Lily?" Sarah asked, her small face suddenly anxious. Tabitha considered. "The adhesive needs 2 days to set properly, and I'll need time to stitch the new dress. Would Saturday be convenient? You could come for lunch if you'd like." The invitation seemed to encompass them both, and Thomas found himself nodding before he'd fully considered the implications. "Saturday would be fine. Thank you for your kindness, Miss Daniels." "Tabitha, please," she reminded him, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. As they prepared to leave, Sarah surprised them both by throwing her arms around Tabitha's waist in a fierce hug. "Thank you for fixing Lily," she murmured against the woman's skirts. Tabitha returned the embrace, her eyes meeting Thomas's over the child's head. Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, of what this moment meant for his daughter. The ride home was filled with Sarah's excited recounting of their afternoon. Thomas listened, offering appropriate responses, while his mind wandered to the schoolteacher with the gentle hands and perceptive gaze. It had been a long time since he'd noticed such things about a woman. A long time since he'd allowed himself to notice. The next 3 days passed with agonizing slowness for Sarah, and though he wouldn't admit it, for Thomas as well. He found himself thinking of Tabitha at odd moments while mending fence line, during the quiet evenings after Sarah went to bed, in the pre-dawn stillness as he prepared for the day's work. By Saturday morning, Sarah was nearly vibrating with anticipation. She insisted on wearing her best dress, the one reserved for Christmas service and special occasions, and asked Thomas 3 times if her hair ribbon was straight. He found himself taking unusual care with his own appearance, too, shaving carefully and donning a clean shirt he normally saved for Sundays. The ride to town seemed shorter this time. The schoolhouse looked different somehow in the bright midday sun, more welcoming, perhaps, or maybe it was just his own perception that had changed. He helped Sarah down from the saddle and straightened her dress before they approached the door. Tabitha greeted them with a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. She wore a simple yellow dress that complemented her golden hair, which today was arranged in a neat braid that hung over one shoulder. "Right on time," she said, ushering them inside. "I've just set out lunch." The schoolroom had been transformed. The teacher's desk had been cleared of its usual papers and inkwells, replaced by a checkered cloth and a simple but appealing spread fresh bread, a crock of butter, sliced ham, pickled vegetables, and what appeared to be an apple pie cooling near the window. "You didn't need to go to such trouble," Thomas said, suddenly self-conscious. "It's no trouble at all," Tabitha assured him. "It's a pleasure to have company. Weekends can be rather quiet." As they settled at the table, Thomas noticed Sarah scanning the room. "Where's Lily?" she asked, unable to contain herself any longer. Tabitha's eyes sparkled with barely suppressed excitement. "She's resting after her treatment. We'll visit her after lunch." The meal was unlike anything Thomas had experienced in recent memory. The food was simple but delicious, clearly prepared with care. More than that, though, was the conversation easy and flowing, punctuated by Sarah's animated contributions and Tabitha's genuine laughter. Thomas found himself sharing stories he hadn't recalled in years, amusing anecdotes from his own childhood. Tales of Sarah's earliest attempts at walking and talking, even a few carefully selected memories from his time in the Army. Tabitha, in turn, spoke of her upbringing in Boston, her training as a teacher, and her decision to come west after losing both parents to influenza 2 years prior. "My aunt thought I was mad," she admitted, passing Thomas a second helping of pie. A respectable spinster of 26 abandoning civilization for the wilds of Dakota Territory. But there are children here who need education just as much as those in Boston, and fewer qualified teachers willing to come. "Their loss is our good fortune," Thomas said before he could stop himself. The look Tabitha gave him, then surprised, pleased, slightly flustered, sent a warmth through him that had nothing to do with the summer heat. Sarah, who had been remarkably patient throughout the meal, finally put down her fork with deliberate precision. "May we please see Lily now?" Tabitha laughed. "Of course, sweetheart, let me fetch her." She disappeared into her quarters, returning moments later with something wrapped in tissue paper. With a flourish, she presented the package to Sarah, who accepted it with trembling hands. The transformation was remarkable. The doll's arm was firmly reattached, the crack in her torso nearly invisible beneath careful reinforcement. But most impressive was the new dress, a perfect miniature gown of blue flowered cotton, complete with tiny pearl buttons down the back, a lace-trimmed collar, and even diminutive bloomers underneath. "You even made her underclothes." Sarah marveled, carefully turning the doll to examine every detail. "A proper lady must be properly attired from the skin out," Tabitha said with mock seriousness that made Sarah giggle. Thomas found himself at a loss for words. The care and skill evident in the repairs went far beyond what he'd expected or what he could possibly repay. "Miss Daniels, Tabitha, this is extraordinary work. You must allow me to compensate you." She shook her head firmly. "This was a labor of love, Mr. Tucker, not commerce." "Sarah's joy is all the payment I require. Thomas," he said, "if I'm to call you Tabitha, then you must call me Thomas." Something changed in her expression, then a softening, a recognition of boundaries crossed. "Thomas, then." The moment stretched between them, interrupted only when Sarah launched into an elaborate explanation to her doll about their ride home and all the things Lily had missed during her treatment. They stayed far longer than Thomas had intended, helping Tabitha clear away the lunch things, listening as she showed Sarah how to properly care for the doll to prevent further damage. By the time they finally prepared to leave, the afternoon was waning toward evening. "Perhaps you'd permit me to call on you again," Thomas said as they stood at the schoolhouse door, "to properly thank you for your kindness." "I'd like that," Tabitha replied, her voice soft but steady. "The school term begins next week, but my Sundays are my own. Then perhaps next Sunday. We attend services at the church here in town. Maybe you'd join us for dinner after. Nothing fancy, just a simple meal at our homestead." The invitation surprised him almost as much as it seemed to surprise her. The thought of bringing someone a lady, no less to his rough cabin with its sparse furnishings and bachelor simplicity, suddenly filled him with trepidation. But Tabitha was nodding. "I'd be delighted, thank you." The week that followed was one of unprecedented industry at the Tucker homestead. Between his regular chores and seasonal work, Thomas somehow found time to repair the sagging front porch step, whitewash the main room, and even construct a crude but serviceable armchair to complement the bench and stools that had previously served as their only seating. Sarah, caught up in his unusual enthusiasm, helped in her own way, gathering wildflowers to place in jars around the cabin, insisting on scrubbing the floorboards until they gleamed, and practicing her best manners in preparation for their guest. Sunday dawned clear and mild. They arrived at the church early, Thomas unusually conscious of his appearance in his one good suit, Sarah proudly carrying Lily, now dressed in her finery. Several of the townsfolk commented on the doll's transformation, and Sarah happily explained about Miss Tate's magic fingers. Thomas found his attention wandering during the service, his eyes repeatedly drawn to where Tabitha sat near the front with Reverend Wilson's family. She wore a dove-gray dress with a high collar and a matching bonnet, her posture perfect as she followed along in her hymnal. Once she glanced back, catching his gaze. The small smile they exchanged felt somehow more intimate than a touch. After the service, they arranged to meet at the hitching post. Thomas had brought his wagon rather than riding horseback, anticipating their guest. Tabitha appeared with a small basket over her arm. "I hope you don't mind," she said as he helped her onto the wagon seat, Sarah already settled in the back. "I've brought apple cobbler. It seemed impolite to arrive empty-handed." "You're spoiling us," Thomas replied, acutely aware of her proximity as he climbed up beside her. "We're not accustomed to such treats." The ride to the homestead passed quickly, filled with Sarah's cheerful commentary on various landmarks and Tabitha's genuine interest in their surroundings. Thomas found himself seeing his land through new eyes, not focusing on the hardships and isolation, but on the beauty of the rolling prairie, the solid construction of the cabin he'd built with his own hands, the promising growth of his modest herd of cattle. As they approached the homestead, however, his confidence faltered. What would Tabitha think of their humble dwelling? The cabin was sturdy but simple, 2 rooms, with the larger serving as kitchen, dining, and living area combined, the smaller a sleeping space he shared with Sarah. The barn and corral were well built but utilitarian. Nothing about their home spoke of comfort or refinement, but when they arrived, Tabitha's reaction dispelled his concerns. "What a lovely place," she exclaimed, taking in the cabin with its freshly whitewashed walls, the neat vegetable garden Sarah had helped plant, the cottonwood trees that provided welcome shade. "You've created something wonderful here, Thomas." Her sincere appreciation warmed him in a way he hadn't expected. "It's not much, but it's ours." The afternoon unfolded with surprising ease. Thomas had prepared a simple but hearty meal: roast beef, potatoes, and carrots from their garden. Tabitha insisted on helping, tying one of Sarah's small aprons over her good dress, and preparing a fresh salad from garden greens while Thomas tended the roast in the cast-iron stove. Sarah was in her element, proudly showing Tabitha every corner of their home, from the special shelf where Lily now recited to the small collection of books they read together each night before bed. "You read to her every evening?" Tabitha asked as they finally sat down to eat. Thomas nodded, slightly embarrassed. "My late wife insisted on it from the time Sarah was born, said a child should grow up with stories in their head and words on their tongue. I'm not much of a reader myself, but I keep up the tradition." "It's a beautiful tradition," Tabitha said softly. "And explains why Sarah's vocabulary is so advanced for her age." Pride swelled in Thomas's chest. "She's a bright one, takes after her mother that way." A shadow crossed Tabitha's face. "May I ask about your wife? Sarah mentioned she's been gone about a year." Thomas glanced at his daughter, who was more interested in arranging her carrots in a pattern than in the adults' conversation. "Rebecca, we lost her to consumption last winter. She was ill for months before that." "I'm so sorry," Tabitha said, her hand briefly touching his across the table. The contact was fleeting but electric. "It was hard," Thomas admitted. "Still is sometimes, but we're managing." Tabitha's gaze held his. "More than managing, I'd say. You've created a loving home and are raising a remarkable daughter. That's no small accomplishment, especially alone." Her words touched something deep within him, a need for recognition he hadn't acknowledged even to himself. Running a homestead while raising a child alone was exhausting, relentless work. To have someone see and appreciate that effort felt like a gift. The conversation shifted to lighter topics as they enjoyed Tabitha's cobbler, which proved as delicious as promised. Sarah regaled them with stories about the animals. She'd befriended a particularly bold chipmunk that visited their woodpile, the family of rabbits that lived near the garden, the meadowlark that sang from the same fence post every morning. As the afternoon waned, Thomas suggested a walk to show Tabitha the rest of the property. Sarah ran ahead, eager to display her favorite climbing tree and the small stream that marked their eastern boundary. "She's thriving here," Tabitha observed as they walked side by side, maintaining a proper distance that somehow still felt intimate. "Not all children adapt so well to frontier life." "She's resilient," Thomas agreed, "though I worry about her isolation." "There are no other children nearby for her to play with. School will help with that. Term starts tomorrow. Will she be attending?" Thomas hesitated. "I hadn't decided. The ride is long for her to manage alone, and I can't spare the time each day to escort her." Several families have similar concerns. Reverend Wilson is organizing a rotation of fathers who will take turns escorting groups of children from outlying homesteads. Perhaps you could join that arrangement. 1 day a week in exchange for knowing she's safely transported the other days. The solution was so practical, so obvious, that Thomas wondered why he hadn't thought of it himself. "That sounds ideal. I'd be happy to participate." "Excellent. Sarah will benefit tremendously from formal education and socializing with other children." And Tabitha smiled slightly. "I confess I would enjoy having her in my classroom." They reached the stream, where Sarah was already engaged in her favorite pastime of building small dams with stones and watching the water find new paths around them. The late afternoon sun caught in Tabitha's hair as she knelt beside the child, admiring her engineering efforts and suggesting improvements. Thomas stood back, struck by the tableau they created. His daughter's dark head bent close to Tabitha's golden one, their laughter mingling with the gentle gurgle of the stream. Something long dormant stirred in his chest, a feeling he'd thought buried with Rebecca. Not the same nothing could replicate his first love, but something new and unexpected. Possibility. The sun was beginning its descent when they finally returned to the cabin. Thomas knew he needed to get Tabitha back to town before darkness fell, but he found himself reluctant for the day to end. "We should probably head back soon," he said as they reached the porch. Disappointment flickered across Tabitha's features. "Of course, I have preparations to complete for tomorrow." Sarah, sensing the impending departure, suddenly wrapped her arms around Tabitha's waist. "Do you have to go?" "You could stay here. I could show you my special hiding place tomorrow." Tabitha knelt to the child's level, gently disentangling herself. "I have to teach school tomorrow, remember, and you're going to be one of my pupils." Sarah's eyes widened. "Really? I'm going to school?" Thomas nodded. "It seems the time has come, little one. You're old enough now." The news distracted Sarah from her disappointment, and she peppered them both with questions about what school would be like as Thomas hitched up the wagon. By the time they were ready to depart, the sun was hanging low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the prairie. The return journey was quieter, Sarah eventually nodding off in the back of the wagon, worn out from the day's excitement. Thomas and Tabitha spoke in low tones, their conversation wandering from practical matters like school schedules to more personal reflections on life in the territory. "You ever regret coming west?" Thomas asked as the lights of Willow Creek came into view. Tabitha considered the question. "There are moments of homesickness, certainly. Boston has comforts and conveniences that Willow Creek can't offer. But no, I don't regret it. There's a purpose here, a sense of building something meaningful." Even with all the hardships, she turned to him, her profile gilded by the setting sun. "Especially with the hardships. Nothing worthwhile comes without struggle, does it?" The simplicity and truth of her statement resonated deeply with him. "No, it doesn't, though sometimes the struggle seems endless." "Perhaps that's why we need community," Tabitha suggested. "To share the burden when it grows too heavy for one set of shoulders." They had reached the schoolhouse. Thomas set the brake and climbed down, circling to help Tabitha from her seat, their hands clasped longer than strictly necessary as she descended. "Thank you for a lovely day," she said, her voice soft in the gathering dusk. "The pleasure was ours," Thomas replied. "Perhaps we could make it a regular occurrence, Sunday dinners, I mean." The smile she gave him then was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. "I'd like that very much." As Thomas drove back home, Sarah sleeping peacefully in the wagon bed, he found himself looking forward to the coming week in a way he hadn't experienced in a very long time. The frontier remained harsh and unforgiving, the work never ending, but somehow the prospect seemed less daunting than before. The days that followed established a new rhythm to their lives. Each morning, Thomas would ride with Sarah to the eastern crossroads where they would meet Jim Dawson and his two sons, who continued on to town while Thomas returned to his chores. In the afternoons, it was Walter Fleming's turn to collect the children and deliver them to their respective crossroads for the final journey home. Sarah flourished under Tabitha's tutelage, coming home each day with new knowledge and excitement. She made friends quickly, particularly with Emma Fleming, who lived on a neighboring homestead about 3 miles south. The girls were the same age and shared a love of dolls and make-believe. Thomas's Thursday duty as escort gave him a legitimate reason to see Tabitha weekly, even if their interaction was limited to brief exchanges as he delivered and collected the children. But their Sunday arrangement continued, becoming a cherished tradition. Sometimes they dined at the Tucker homestead. Other times, when weather threatened, Tabitha would prepare a meal in her small quarters behind the schoolhouse. As autumn progressed, bringing cooler temperatures and shorter days, Thomas found himself counting the hours between their meetings. Tabitha had become essential to their lives in ways he hadn't anticipated, not just as Sarah's teacher or even as a friend, but as someone who brought light and warmth into their existence. It was during an early November Sunday, as they walked along the stream while Sarah played nearby, that Thomas finally found the courage to speak of his feelings. "I never expected this," he began, his voice rough with emotion. After Rebecca died, I thought that part of my life was finished. I would raise Sarah, work the land, and that would be enough. Tabitha's cheeks were pink from the cold, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. And now I find myself looking forward rather than back, seeing possibilities I'd thought closed to me. She stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Thomas, please," he interrupted gently. "Let me say this while I have the courage. You've become important to me, Tabitha, to us. The days when I see you are brighter somehow. I find myself thinking of you at odd moments, wondering what you'd think of a particular sunset, or if you'd enjoy the first taste of the season's preserves." Her eyes searched his face, wide and uncertain. "We've known each other only a few months, I know. And I'm not suggesting that is, I wouldn't presume." He took a deep breath. "I'm simply telling you that my feelings have grown beyond friendship. If yours haven't, I understand completely, and I hope we can continue as we have been." The moment stretched between them, filled with the rustling of dry leaves and Sarah's distant laughter. Then, slowly, Tabitha reached out and took his hand. "Mine have too," she admitted softly. "Grown beyond friendship, I mean. I didn't expect it either. After my parents died, I thought my path was clear. I would teach, be useful, find fulfillment in my work. I wasn't looking for this." Relief and joy washed through him. Emboldened, he raised her gloved hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Where do we go from here?" A smile brightened her face. "Forward, I suppose, one step at a time." The weeks that followed were filled with a cautious, blossoming courtship. They maintained propriety, always meeting in public, or with Sarah present, careful of Tabitha's reputation in the small community where she played such a visible role. But within those boundaries, their connection deepened. Thomas found himself rediscovering parts of himself he'd thought lost: his sense of humor, his capacity for tenderness, the simple pleasure of anticipation. Tabitha brought books to share, introducing him to poetry and literature he'd never encountered. He taught her to ride properly, not side saddle as she'd learned back east, but astride like a prairie woman needed to. Sarah watched their growing attachment with a child's keen perception. One evening, as Thomas tucked her into bed, she asked with disarming directness, "Are you going to marry Miss Tate, Papa?" The question caught him off guard. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" Sarah yawned, cuddling Lily close. "You look at her the way Mr. Fleming looks at Mrs. Fleming. And you smile more when she's here." Out of the mouths of babes, Thomas thought. Would it bother you if I did? Someday, I mean. His daughter considered this seriously. Would she live here with us? That's generally how marriage works, yes. Would she still be my teacher? At school, yes. At home, she'd be. He hesitated, unsure how to explain. Like a new mama, Sarah suggested. The question pierced him. "No one could ever replace your mother, Sarah. You know that, right?" She nodded solemnly. "I know, but Mama's in heaven and she can't come back, and Miss Tate makes you happy." "She makes me happy too, and she fixed Lily when she was broken." The simple logic of children, Thomas thought. Out of all Tabitha's qualities, it was her kindness in mending a cherished doll that had won his daughter's approval. "I haven't asked her yet," he admitted, "and she might say no." Sarah shook her head with the supreme confidence of childhood. "She won't say no. She loves us." The conviction in his daughter's voice stayed with Thomas long after she'd fallen asleep. Did Tabitha love them? He believed she cared deeply, but love was a weighty word, especially in a courtship as young as theirs. As November gave way to December, preparations for the Christmas season occupied the town. The school planned a special pageant, with the children performing tableaus of the nativity story and reciting seasonal poems. Sarah practiced her 3 lines diligently each night, determined to make her teacher proud. The evening of the pageant arrived with a light snow falling, dusting Willow Creek in white, and lending a magical quality to the proceedings. The schoolhouse was transformed, desks pushed against walls, benches arranged for the audience, evergreen boughs and red ribbons decorating the windows. A small stable had been constructed at the front, where the older children would enact the sacred scene. Thomas sat with the other parents, watching with pride as Sarah, dressed as an angel with paper wings and a tinsel halo, recited her lines perfectly. But his gaze kept straying to Tabitha, who moved among the children with calm efficiency, adjusting costumes, prompting forgotten lines, radiating a quiet joy that seemed to encompass the entire room. After the performance, as families mingled over cider and Christmas cookies, Reverend Wilson approached Thomas with a hearty handshake. "Fine job your Sarah did tonight," the minister said. "And I must say, our Miss Daniels has been a godsend to this community. The children have progressed remarkably under her tutelage." "She's a gifted teacher," Thomas agreed, the older man's eyes twinkled. "Among other qualities I'm sure you've noticed." Thomas felt heat rise to his face. "Sir, come now, Tucker, I may be a man of God, but I'm not blind. You've been calling on the lady regularly these past months. The whole town's noticed." The thought that their courtship had become common knowledge was both embarrassing and oddly liberating. "Is that a problem?" Reverend Wilson clapped him on the shoulder. "Quite the contrary. It's high time both of you found some happiness. She's a fine woman, and you're a good man who's had more than his share of sorrow. The Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing the right souls together when they need each other most." The minister's blessing, unexpected as it was, resolved something in Thomas's mind. He'd been considering a Christmas proposal, wondering if it was too soon, if Tabitha might think him impetuous. But perhaps the timing was exactly right. He found her later after most families had departed, tidying the schoolroom with the efficient movements he'd come to admire. "Can I help?" he offered, picking up scattered programs from the benches. Tabitha smiled gratefully. "Thank you, where's Sarah?" with Emma Fleming. Her parents invited Sarah for a sleepover. Their Christmas gift to the girls, apparently. How lovely. She paused, seeming to register the implication. "So you're free this evening?" The question hung between them, laden with possibility. "I am. And I was wondering if you might join me for a walk. The snow's stopped, and the moon is full." She hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Let me get my coat." Willow Creek was transformed by moonlight and fresh snow, the buildings softened into fairy tale versions of themselves. They walked slowly, their breath mingling in the cold air, their shoulders occasionally brushing. Thomas led them to the small town square, where a community Christmas tree had been erected, decorated with paper chains, dried berries, and a few precious glass ornaments donated by the wealthier families. "It's beautiful," Tabitha murmured, her face upturned to the star placed atop the tree. "Yes, it is," Thomas agreed, though he wasn't looking at the tree. He took her hand, gently turning her to face him. "Tabitha, there's something I want to ask you." Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. "Yes." Thomas had rehearsed this moment in his mind a dozen times, preparing eloquent phrases and reasoned arguments. But standing there, with moonlight silvering her hair and her gaze steady on his, all his prepared words fled. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I have since the day you fixed Sarah's doll with such care, showing a kindness to a child and a stranger that asked nothing in return." Tabitha's breath caught audibly. "Thomas, please, let me finish. I know it hasn't been long, and I know we come from different worlds. You had a life of culture and education in Boston. I'm a rough homesteader with calloused hands and simple ways. But I believe we fit together, like pieces of something that was broken and has been made whole again." He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet pouch. From it, he produced a ring, a simple band of gold with a small pearl set in its center. "It was my mother's," he explained. "Not fancy, but given with a love that lasted 40 years until she died." Slowly, he knelt in the snow before her, holding the ring up in offering. "Tabitha Daniels, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Of making a family with Sarah and me?" Tears glistened in her eyes, catching the moonlight like diamonds. For one heart-stopping moment, Thomas feared he'd misread everything, moved too quickly, asked too much. Then she smiled, a radiant, joyful smile that dispelled all doubt. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Thomas Tucker, I would be honored to be your wife." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her in his arms. Their first kiss was gentle, reverent, a promise sealed beneath winter stars and witnessed only by the silent snowbound town. When they finally drew apart, Tabitha rested her forehead against his chest. "I should warn you," she said, her voice muffled against his coat, "I've never been particularly skilled at traditional homesteading tasks. My cooking is passable at best, and my experience with livestock is limited to the classroom pet rabbit." Thomas laughed, joy bubbling up irrepressibly. "I'm not marrying you for your butter-churning abilities, though I'm sure you'll learn, just as I'll improve my reading under your tutelage. We'll figure it out together." She looked up at him, her expression suddenly serious. "There's something else you should know. The doctor in Boston told me I might have difficulty. That is, bearing children. There was an illness when I was younger." He silenced her with a gentle finger to her lips. "Sarah and I are already more family than I dared hope for after losing Rebecca. If God blesses us with more children, we'll rejoice. If not, our home will still be full of love." The relief in her eyes was answer enough. They walked back to the schoolhouse hand in hand, making plans for a spring wedding after the worst of winter had passed. Reverend Wilson would perform the ceremony, of course. The schoolchildren would be invited. Sarah would be overjoyed, though not surprised, if her earlier comments were any indication. "She's been hoping for this," Thomas admitted as they reached Tabitha's door. "She told me weeks ago that you wouldn't say no because you love us." Tabitha's eyes softened. "Wise beyond her years, that one. She was right, you know. I do love you both very much." Their goodbye that night was lingering, filled with the sweet anticipation of a shared future. As Thomas rode home under the winter moon, he marveled at the unexpected turns his life had taken. A little over a year ago, he'd been a grieving widower struggling to raise a daughter alone on the unforgiving frontier. Now he was engaged to be married, his heart full of hope and plans. All because his daughter's doll had broken, and a kind woman had fixed it with thread and care. The winter months passed in a flurry of preparations. Thomas expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom for Sarah and enlarging the main room to accommodate Tabitha's books and the few treasured furnishings she'd brought from Boston. The school term continued, with Sarah's progress accelerating under the combined influence of her teachers' expertise and their evening reading sessions, which now often included Tabitha when weather permitted her to join them. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in April, when the worst of winter would have passed, but before the spring planting demanded Thomas's full attention. The entire community embraced the occasion with enthusiasm. Mrs. Gunderson and several other town wives organized a quilting bee to create a wedding gift. The men of the church, led by Reverend Wilson, arranged a building day to help Thomas construct a proper front porch with a swing, a luxury Tabitha had once mentioned missing from her childhood home. Sarah threw herself into the preparations with characteristic determination, insisting on helping with everything from selecting fabric for Tabitha's wedding dress to planning the flowers for the church. Her excitement reached fever pitch when Tabitha asked her to be a junior bridesmaid, with Lily serving as honorary flower girl. As the wedding day approached, Thomas found himself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this point. One afternoon, while making final adjustments to the porch swing, he voiced these thoughts to Jim Dawson, who had become a friend during their shared school escort duties. "You know what's funny?" Thomas said, tightening the last bolt. "If Sarah's doll hadn't broken that day, if Tabitha hadn't been in the store right then to offer her help, our paths might never have crossed in a meaningful way." Jim, a pragmatic man who had lived in the territory for over a decade, chuckled. "That's frontier life for you, Tucker. Out here, with everything stripped down to essentials, you see what truly matters. Back east, folks get caught up in social standing and property and all manner of nonsense. Here, it's simpler. A man needs a good woman by his side, children to raise right, neighbors to depend on." The rest is just decoration. Still, Thomas mused, it amazes me how something so small, a broken doll, could change everything. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Jim said, unconsciously echoing Reverend Wilson's earlier sentiment. And sometimes he works through broken things to make something better than what was there before. The wedding day dawned clear and mild, the prairie beginning to green with early spring growth. The small church was filled beyond capacity, with some guests standing along the walls to witness the union of the schoolteacher and the widowed homesteader. Wildflowers gathered by Sarah and her friends decorated every surface, their simple beauty perfectly suited to the occasion. Tabitha had chosen a dress of ivory silk, not ostentatious, but elegant in its simplicity, with lace at the collar and cuffs that she'd carefully salvaged from her mother's wedding gown. As she walked down the short aisle on Reverend Wilson's arm, standing in for her deceased father, Thomas felt his breath catch at her radiance. Sarah preceded her, solemn in her responsibilities, carefully placing each foot as they'd practiced. She carried Lily, now attired in a miniature version of Tabitha's dress, complete with a diminutive bouquet tied to the doll's porcelain hand. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. Thomas and Tabitha had written their own vows, speaking of partnership, respect, and a love built on friendship and shared purpose. When Reverend Wilson invited Thomas to kiss his bride, the cheer that went up from the assembled townspeople nearly raised the modest church's roof. The celebration continued at the schoolhouse, transformed by the women of the community into a festive hall with bunting, flowers, and tables laden with food. A fiddler from the next town over provided music, and children darted between adults' legs in impromptu games. As evening approached, Thomas found a moment alone with his new wife, drawing her away from the festivities to the quiet of her quarters soon to be vacated as she moved permanently to the homestead. "Happy, Mrs. Tucker?" he asked, still savoring the new name on his tongue. Tabitha's smile was answer enough, but she spoke anyway. "Happier than I ever imagined possible, and a little overwhelmed by it all, to be honest. Second thoughts," he teased gently. She shook her head firmly. "Not one. But it is a remarkable thing to go from being alone in the world to suddenly having a husband, a daughter, a home, a whole community that feels like family. It's a lot of change in a short time," Thomas acknowledged. "If you need more time before leaving the schoolhouse, no," she interrupted, placing her hand on his cheek. "My place is with you and Sarah now. The schoolhouse will still be here for teaching, but home is where you are." The simple declaration warmed him to his core. He drew her close, marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms, as if shaped by Providence specifically for him. "I love you, Tabitha Tucker." "And I love you," she whispered back. "More than I have words to express, even with all my book learning." They rejoined the celebration, accepting congratulations and well wishes from what seemed like every resident of Willow Creek and the surrounding homesteads. Sarah, exhausted from excitement and unaccustomed socializing, eventually fell asleep on a bench, Lily clutched to her chest. As the evening concluded, Thomas carried his sleeping daughter to the wagon while Tabitha gathered the few possessions she would need, before returning for the rest of her belongings the following week. The three of them, four, counting Lily, made their way home under a canopy of stars, the first journey of their new life together. The adjustment to married life brought both joys and challenges. Tabitha continued teaching, riding to and from town with Thomas and Sarah on school days. Her Eastern education sometimes clashed with frontier practicalities, leading to humorous mishaps like the time she attempted to make soap using a Boston recipe, creating a concoction that smelled lovely but cleaned nothing. But she approached these learning experiences with the same determination she brought to her classroom, gradually mastering the skills needed for homestead life. Thomas, for his part, found unexpected pleasure in the evenings spent reading aloud from Tabitha's books, his literacy improving under her patient guidance. Sarah blossomed with the stability and love their new family provided. The nightmares that had plagued her since her mother's death gradually subsided. She excelled at school and developed a close circle of friends, no longer the solemn, isolated child she had been by midsummer. There was new cause for celebration. Tabitha was expecting a child. The news came as a joyful surprise, given her earlier concerns about fertility. Thomas found her one afternoon sitting on the porch swing, hands resting on her still flat stomach, an expression of wonder on her face. "The doctor said it might never happen," she told him as he joined her. "I was afraid to hope." Thomas covered her hands with his own. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together, but I have a good feeling about this little one. Tucker babies are sturdy stock." Sarah was ecstatic at the prospect of a sibling, immediately making plans for sharing her room and teaching the baby everything she knew. She spoke to Tabitha's stomach each night, updating the unborn child on important developments: a new calf in the barn, the progress of her reading lessons, the latest adventures of Lily, who remained her cherished companion despite the acquisition of new toys. As Tabitha's pregnancy progressed, the community rallied around them once again. Mrs. Gunderson kept aside the softest fabrics from her store's shipments for baby clothes. Jim Dawson's wife, a former midwife, visited regularly to check on Tabitha's health. The school board arranged for a substitute teacher for the spring term, ensuring Tabitha could rest properly in her final months. Winter settled over the prairie, harsher than the previous year, but finding the Tucker homestead better prepared. The expanded cabin was snug and warm, with Tabitha's feminine touches: curtains at the windows, rag rugs on the floors, carefully preserved flowers arranged in jars, transforming it from a mere shelter to a true home. Christmas was a particularly joyous occasion. Thomas had ridden nearly 30 miles to the railroad town to purchase special gifts: a proper writing desk for Tabitha, a set of illustrated fairy tales for Sarah, and a rocking chair for the baby's corner of their bedroom. Tabitha, now showing prominently, had secretly knitted Thomas a warm scarf and crafted a new dress for Lily, who remained in a place of honor in Sarah's room. On Christmas Eve, as they sat together before the fire, Sarah suddenly asked, "Do you remember when Lily broke Papa?" "And Miss Tate, I mean Mama Tabitha fixed her." "Of course," Thomas replied. "That was an important day." Sarah nodded solemnly. "I was so sad. I thought Lily was ruined forever, but Mama Tabitha made her better than before." Tabitha, who had been embroidering a small gown for the baby, looked up with a soft smile. "I'm not sure about better, sweetheart. Different, perhaps." "No, better," Sarah insisted with a child's certainty, "because she was fixed with love. That makes things better, not just different." Thomas met his wife's gaze over their daughter's head, a world of understanding passing between them. Both had been broken in their own ways, he by grief, she by isolation and loss. Together they had mended each other, creating something stronger at the broken places. Spring arrived with its usual capriciousness, alternating between warm, promising days and sudden freezing rains. Tabitha's time drew near, bringing with it a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The nearest doctor was still in the railroad town, too far to count on in an emergency. They would rely on Mrs. Dawson's experience and the grace of God. The baby, however, had his own schedule. On a mild April evening, almost exactly a year after their wedding, Tabitha went into labor. Thomas sent Sarah to stay with the Flemings and rode for Mrs. Dawson, returning to find his wife calmly arranging the bedroom for delivery, pausing only during contractions. "You should be resting," he admonished gently, taking the linens from her hands. Tabitha shook her head stubbornly. "Movement helps." "My mother always said women weren't meant to birth babies lying still like invalids." Mrs. Dawson, arriving shortly after, confirmed this wisdom. "Let her walk as long as she's comfortable. First babies often take their time." The labor progressed through the night, Tabitha alternating between walking the cabin's length and resting on their bed. Thomas remained by her side, holding her hand through each contraction, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement even as his own fear mounted with her increasing pain. Dawn was breaking when Mrs. Dawson finally announced, "It's time to push, dear. The baby's ready to meet you." What followed was both the most terrifying and awe-inspiring experience of Thomas's life. Tabitha's strength amazed him, her determination, her focus, her refusal to surrender to exhaustion even as the ordeal stretched into its 15th hour. And then, suddenly, it was over. A lusty cry filled the room as Mrs. Dawson triumphantly lifted a squirming, red-faced infant. "You have a son," she announced, placing the swaddled bundle in Tabitha's trembling arms. Thomas stared in wonder at the tiny being they had created, perfect fingers and toes, a shock of dark hair like his own, eyes that, when they briefly opened, revealed the same hazel as his mother's. "Hello, little one," Tabitha whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We've been waiting for you." "What shall we call him?" Thomas asked, his voice rough with emotion as he touched his son's cheek with a reverent finger. They had discussed names during the long winter evenings, family names from both sides, names from Tabitha's beloved books, biblical names that would please Reverend Wilson. But in this moment, looking at their son, Tabitha suggested something they hadn't considered. "What about Samuel?" "It means asked of God or heard by God because he truly is an answered prayer." Thomas nodded, overcome. "Samuel Tucker, a good, strong name for a frontier boy." Mrs. Dawson, who had been quietly cleaning up, smiled approvingly. "A fine choice. Now, I'll go prepare something for the new mother to eat. She needs to regain her strength." Left alone with their son, Thomas and Tabitha shared a moment of profound connection, exhausted, exhilarated, transformed once again by love's capacity to create something new from what was broken. Later that day, Thomas rode to collect Sarah from the Flemings. She approached the baby with uncharacteristic caution, studying his tiny features with solemn concentration. "He's very small," she finally pronounced. "And red." Tabitha laughed weakly from the bed. "All new babies look that way." "He'll change as he grows." Sarah nodded, accepting this information. Then, very carefully, she placed Lily beside the swaddled infant. "This is your sister, Samuel. She's been waiting to meet you too." Thomas felt his throat tighten at the gesture, his daughter welcoming her brother with the most precious thing she owned, the doll that had, in a way, brought them all together. The weeks that followed were a blur of adjustments, sleepless nights, the constant demands of a newborn, finding new rhythms to their family life. Thomas took over many of Sarah's care responsibilities, ensuring she didn't feel displaced by her brother's arrival. Tabitha recovered quickly, eager to resume her role as mother and teacher, though she delayed her return to the schoolhouse until autumn. By Samuel's christening in June, they had settled into their expanded family with surprising ease. The ceremony at the church was followed by a celebration at their homestead, the porch and yard filled with friends and neighbors who had become like extended family. As evening approached and guests began to depart, Thomas found Tabitha on their porch swing, Samuel sleeping against her shoulder while Sarah played nearby with Emma Fleming and their dolls. The setting sun bathed everything in golden light, the cabin they had built together, the garden now lush with summer growth, the rolling prairie beyond that no longer seemed quite so harsh or lonely. "Happy?" he asked, echoing the question he'd posed on their wedding day as he sat beside her. Tabitha leaned into him, her free hand finding his. "Beyond anything I could have imagined. And you?" Thomas surveyed the life they had created, his beautiful wife, his spirited daughter, his infant son, the home that now truly deserved the name. All of it arising from a moment of heartbreak, a little girl's tears over a broken doll, a stranger's kindness in mending what was precious. "I never thought I'd have this again," he admitted. "After Rebecca died, I convinced myself that loving once was all I'd be granted. That my job was just to raise Sarah and work the land until my days ended." Tabitha squeezed his hand gently. "And now?" Now I understand that broken things don't have to stay broken, that sometimes they can be mended into something new and equally beautiful. Different, as you said, but not lesser. Like Lily, Tabitha murmured, glancing at where the doll sat propped against Sarah's lap, still wearing the dress Tabitha had sewn with such care. Like all of us, Thomas agreed. Broken in our ways, but made whole again through love. Samuel stirred against Tabitha's shoulder, making the small mewling sounds that preceded waking. Sarah, sensing her brother's imminent demands, abandoned her play to climb onto the swing beside them, creating a perfect tableau of the family they had become. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Thomas Tucker held his family close, grateful beyond words for the unexpected journey that had brought them to this moment. The frontier remained a challenging place, full of hardships and uncertainties. But faced together, with love and determination, even the harshest wilderness could become a home. And it had all begun with a broken doll and the woman who knew how to mend it with thread and care.